The AP government exam, 4 FRQs, 50% of your school. You can't afford to mess these up, so I'm gonna give you 5 tips for squeezing every point out of these questions that can be squeezed. What's the past tense of squeeze? Squoze? Squeezed? That sounds wrong. Anyway, by the end of this video, I'm going to give you a simple way to write a thesis and support it with evidence for your argumentative essay, and you really need to pay attention to that. Anyway, tip number 1, understand the task verbs in the prompt. In the first 3 FRQs, almost every prompt is going to start with one of 3 verbs: identify, describe, or explain. And when you see those, you need to understand what each word is asking you to do, because if you don't do what that word requires, no point for you. So identify. That is literally what it sounds like. You just have to name something. Identify a civil liberty common to both cases. All you have to do is write one sentence that restates the important parts of the prompt and then add your answer. A civil liberty common to both cases is freedom of speech. That's it. Don't make it harder than it is. Now, describe requires a little bit more. Here, you need to name something and define it. So in this question, you have to describe an enumerated power that allows Congress to regulate business. So you need to write a complete sentence naming the Commerce Clause and defining it, which gives authority to Congress to regulate interstate commerce. Okay, now explain is the toughest of all, and this typically requires a short paragraph to answer. So to give a good explain answer, you need to do 3 things, and I've already told you about the first 2. First, identify your answer. Then second, describe it, which is to say define it. And then the third step is to answer the question why. For example, this question asks about how a third-party candidate could encourage participatory democracy. So my answer needs to name participatory democracy, then explain what that means, and then go on to explain why third-party candidates encourage it. In this case, I could talk about how third-party candidates often represent interests that are overlooked by the major parties, thus attracting more voters who care about those issues. Now, to be clear, those aren't the only words that introduce questions, but those are the ones that you will see the vast majority of the time. And now let's get to some tips for each of the different kinds of questions. Tip number 2, write about the scenario. The first FRQ will always be the concept application question. So they'll give you a little story about some political concept, and then you have to apply what you know with the 3 prompts. But here is the giant gaping chasm into which all of your points will fall and perish. If you don't reference the scenario in your answer, it doesn't matter how great your answer is. It could be the best answer that has ever been written in the history of political science. If you don't include a portion of the scenario in your answer, no point. And look, this is not a heavy lift. It's not hard to do. That first question we looked at about the Commerce Clause talks about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook. So yes, name the Commerce Clause, then explain what it is, but then for the love of all that is good in this world, add a few words or a sentence with words from the scenario. For example, the Commerce Clause in Article 1 gives Congress the authority to regulate interstate commerce. And now add the scenario. Since Facebook's business crosses state boundaries, Congress has the authority to regulate it. So make sure you reference the scenario in your answer. Just do it. Just do it. Okay, tip number 3, don't make the data analysis harder than it is. Now, the secret of this question is that the first 2 questions are basically free points. You get a point. You get a point. Look, so they give you some kind of data to interpret, and these first 2 questions are basically asking, do you understand what is in this graph? So who had the most women and ethnic minorities in his cabinet? It's Obama? Yeah, so I restate the important parts of the prompt and I add my answer. It really is that easy. And the second question is just a little broader. In the first, where they were asking you to only tell them about one part of the graph, here they are asking you to tell them about the whole graph. So look at it and figure out what's the pattern here. Oh, Democrats have more women and ethnic minorities in their cabinets than Republicans who staff their positions with a majority of white men. That's it. Free points. Now, to be fair, the next 2 questions are going to make you think a little bit more, but for real, on those first 2 questions, you're going to think, this is too easy. The AP overlords are trying to trick me. But no, it's actually that simple. Like, don't make it harder than it is. Tip number 4, make a clean SCOTUS comparison. What I mean by clean is don't clutter up your brain with piles of useless information about your required cases. You only need to know 3 pieces of information about each of the 15 required cases. The facts of the case, like what set of events led to this case, the constitutional principle of the case, and the holding of the case, or, the decision that the court made. Look, I've got these 3 pieces of information broken down for every case in this playlist right here, so, go crazy. Here's what's insane. This question is typically worth 4 points, and 2 of them are kind of freebies if you know all the stuff that I just said. The first question will always ask you to identify some constitutional principle or amendment or clause or legal doctrine or whatever that is common to both cases. But look, if you know what that is for your required case, you don't even need to waste time searching for it in the unknown case that they gave you. And the same for the next part. Here, they're always going to ask you to compare the 2 cases. Either compare the facts of the case or the reasoning of the court or whatever. And again, if you know your cases, then this first part of the question is a giveaway. Now, the third question typically requires more work and asks you to apply a different concept from the course to these cases. But the point is, if you learn these cases, you'll be fine here. And finally, tip number 5, write a solid thesis and support it with evidence for your argumentative essay. And this is, not as hard as you think. things. First, the thesis, and they tell you exactly how to earn the point right here under the question. Your thesis has to make a defensible claim and establish a line of reasoning, and let me tell you what that means and then give you an easy formula for doing it. Now listen, you have to get your thesis right. If your thesis doesn't pass muster, then you can only earn 1 point for the whole essay because the rest of the points depend on a proper thesis. So let's talk about this. First, a defensible claim. That means your thesis needs to take a position. This is not as hard as it sounds because in the prompt they give you 2 positions to choose from. Here you can choose either legal challenges or social movements as the best means for changing federal policy. So the first part of your thesis formula is this. You state your position and then you restate the prompt. So here it would be social movements are the most effective means of changing federal policy in the area of civil rights. Now that is a defensible claim, but listen, it is not enough to earn the point. You have to go one step further and establish a line of reasoning. And all that means is that you have to briefly explain why your position is true. And the formula here is just one word: because. So your position plus restate the prompt plus because. So take what we already wrote and add this. Because large groups of Americans can more effectively put pressure on the government to work in favor of civil rights. Okay, now that you have a thesis, you have to support that thesis with evidence. In my opinion, the best way to do that is with the VET method: vocabulary, explain, tie back. Name a vocabulary word, explain what it means, and then tie it back to the thesis. And it's that last part that makes or breaks it. To tie evidence back to your thesis, write one sentence with the vocabulary and the explanation, and then write another sentence beginning with "this shows" or "this demonstrates," and then make an explicit connection between your evidence and your thesis. Here's an example of how that looks. I'm not going to read it, so you can pause it and have a look. Now, if you're still struggling with FRQs, you should click here for more detailed information on how to understand the 4 FRQs, and I've got a video devoted to each. And you can click right here to get my AP Gov review pack, which has everything you need to get a 5 on your exam this May. And I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.